He bought an abandoned orphanage, then discovered something no one could believe to this day. The children's shoes were still lined up by the door. 43 pairs. From tiny, scuffed-up boots made for a toddler to worn-out work shoes that must have belonged to a teenager. But that wasn't the strange part. Not by a long shot. Every single pair was perfectly clean. Not just clean, but polished. Polished to a high shine, as if every child had meticulously prepared them for a special occasion, right before they were all abandoned forever. Hiram Sinclair stood in the vast, empty hallway, the freshly signed deed clutched in his hand. This was supposed to be his simplest business purchase yet. An old, forgotten building on the edge of the territory, perfect for his new hotel expansion. The seller, a man with shifty eyes and a sweaty brow, had assured him it had been vacant for at least 20 years. Or so he claimed. But the air told a different story. Beneath the thick layer of dust and decay, the faint, unmistakable smell of freshly baked bread still lingered. It was ghostly, a scent trapped in time. And the dust patterns on the floor weren't right. They showed the clean outlines where heavy furniture had been dragged away recently. Not decades ago. Weeks ago, at most. Something was deeply, horribly wrong with the story he'd been told. He pushed open the door to the main office, the hinges groaning in protest. There, on a massive oak desk, a leather-bound ledger lay open. The ink on the final entry was still a crisp, dark black, not faded with age. It was dated just 3 months ago, written in a steady, careful hand. Final transfer complete. All records relocated. May they forgive us for what we had to do. But that was impossible. Hiram had checked the official town records himself. Every single document stated this orphanage had been shuttered, boarded up, and condemned 20 years earlier following a supposed funding crisis. So what was this entry? Who wrote it? He lifted the heavy ledger, and his fingers brushed against the pages underneath. He felt it instantly. Impressions. Someone had written on the page above this one with so much force, so much emotion, that it had left a ghost of their words pressed deep into the paper below. He angled the page toward the dusty light streaming in from the grimy window, his eyes squinting to make out the faint, fragmented words. Separated from brother. False name given. Payment received. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just an orphanage. They had been keeping 2 sets of records, a clean one for the public, and a secret one for themselves. He walked through the long, silent dormitories, the feeling of dread growing with every step. More questions piled up like dark storm clouds on the horizon. Every iron bed frame had been stripped clean, the thin mattresses stacked in a corner. But as he ran his hand over one, he felt something lumped underneath. He lifted the mattress. Tucked away against the springs was a child's drawing, done in charcoal on a scrap of paper. It showed 2 small stick figures holding hands, one slightly taller than the other. At the bottom, written in shaky, desperate letters, were 4 words. Find my sister Mary. He moved to another room, his boots echoing in the unnerving silence. A floorboard near the wall was loose. He pried it up with his fingertips. Underneath, someone had carved dozens and dozens of tiny marks into the dark wood. They were grouped in sets of 5, with a final slash through each set. Someone had been trapped here, counting the days, or maybe even the years. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found in the basement. The air down there was cold and damp, thick with the smell of earth and secrets. It was a maze of storage rooms, shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. But instead of old supplies, the shelves were filled with plain wooden boxes, hundreds of them, and none of them were labeled with names, only numbers. He pulled down a box at random. Box 847. His fingers trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed tissue paper, was a little girl's dress. It was small, faded blue, with a single button missing from the collar, and underneath it, a folded note. He picked it up. Age 7. Brown hair, quiet disposition, suitable for Western Territory placement. The children hadn't been adopted. They hadn't been given new homes. They had been sold. They were inventory. Hiram's hands shook so badly he almost dropped the box. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the stone walls pressing in on him, the air thick and hard to breathe. He had come here to scout a location for a luxury hotel, a place of comfort and relaxation. Instead, he was standing in a tomb, surrounded by the ghosts of children whose lives had been reduced to nothing more than inventory notes. Box after box lined the oppressive shelves, each one a coffin for a stolen childhood. A worn leather ball, a single baby shoe, a tattered book with a child's name scribbled inside, only to be violently crossed out. He stumbled back upstairs, desperate for fresh air, his stomach churning with a mixture of horror and rage. As he walked back through the main hall, Hiram noticed details he had missed before, details that now screamed a sinister truth. Tiny scratch marks scarred the door frames, right at the height of a small child, as if desperate little fingers had clawed at the wood trying to get out. The windows hadn't just been boarded up. They'd been nailed shut from the outside, not the inside. It wasn't to keep people out. It was to keep the children in. In the kitchen, he saw a stack of large serving bowls, big enough to prepare meals for dozens of children. But when he opened the drawers, the eating utensils, the forks, the spoons, the tin cups, numbered far, far fewer. The arithmetic was a nightmare. 43 pairs of shoes by the door. But where were the plates and cups for 43 mouths? It didn't make sense. Unless some of the children weren't allowed to eat at the table. Unless some of them were treated differently. Less than human. He returned to the main office, a cold fury now guiding his actions. He yanked out every drawer from the large oak desk, throwing them to the floor, searching for anything else, any other clue. As he pulled out the very last drawer, he felt it hit something at the back. It wouldn't come all the way out. Wedged against the back panel, almost invisible in the shadows, was a single, folded piece of paper. He carefully worked it free. The handwriting on this note was completely different from the neat, cold script in the ledger. This was shaky, hurried, desperate. They are taking the children west, not to families to work. The buyers pay more for the young ones who won't ask questions about their real names. I tried to stop it, but I am just one person against too many. If someone finds this note, please know that we tried to keep records of their real identities. The truth is hidden where only the children could reach. The note was signed with 2 simple initials. C.B. Hiram looked around the empty, silent office with new eyes, where only the children could reach. It had to be low to the ground. He got down on his hands and knees, his heart pounding against his ribs. He began examining the lower walls, running his hands along the dusty baseboards and the worn chair rail molding. And then, in the dark corner behind the desk, his fingers found it. A section of the rich, dark wood paneling that moved. It was almost imperceptible, just a slight give when he pressed on it. He worked his fingernails around the edges, prying and pulling until a small, square panel popped free with a soft click, revealing a dark, hollow space hidden within the wall. Inside sat a small metal box, rusted at the hinges. It was small enough to hide, but large enough to hold a world of secrets. As Hiram's fingers closed around the cold metal, he heard a sound that made him freeze. The massive front door of the orphanage creaked open. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed in the long hallway. The steps of someone who knew this building intimately. Someone who had returned for something they had left behind. The footsteps were coming closer. Coming straight for the office. Hiram's mind raced. He shoved the cold metal box deep into the pocket of his coat and hastily fumbled the wood panel back into place, pressing it until it clicked shut. He stood up just as the footsteps stopped, right outside the office door. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Then a voice cut through it, sharp and cold as a winter wind. "I know someone's in there." It was the voice of a woman. An older woman, with the kind of unquestionable authority that came from years of commanding absolute obedience. "This building has been closed for 20 years. You have no right to be here." Hiram took a breath, trying to steady his nerves, and stepped into the doorway. He found himself face to face with a tall, severe-looking woman in a faded black dress that seemed as old as the building itself. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight, unforgiving bun, and her pale blue eyes held the hardness of someone who had made 1,000 difficult decisions and never lost a wink of sleep over any of them. "I'm Hiram Sinclair," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I bought this property 3 days ago." He pulled the deed from his pocket, the paper a shield against her piercing gaze. "And you are?" The woman's expression shifted, but only slightly. A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed her face before being locked away again. "Susanna Radcliffe. I was the director here until circumstances forced us to close." Her eyes moved past him, her gaze sweeping across the office, cataloging every detail. The open ledger, the scattered drawers on the floor. Her eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you planning to do with this building? Turn it into some gaudy hotel?" Hiram watched her reaction, feeling the weight of the hidden box against his chest. "That was the plan," he said slowly. "Though now I'm more curious about what really happened here. The previous owner was rather vague about the details." Susanna let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. It was a sharp, bitter sound. "I'm sure he was. Some stories are better left buried, Mr. Sinclair. This place has already caused enough pain for enough people." She moved past him into the office, her movements filled with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours, countless years within these 4 walls. Her long, bony fingers traced the edge of the desk, coming to rest on the open ledger. "You've been reading our records, I see." "Just trying to understand what kind of operation you ran here," Hiram replied, his tone carefully neutral. "We provided homes for unwanted children," she said, the words coming out smooth and rehearsed, as if she had given this exact speech 100 times before. "We gave them shelter, food, and opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Not everyone appreciated our methods, but the results speak for themselves." Hiram thought of the note signed CB. He thought of the boxes in the basement, the scratch marks on the doors. "What kind of results?" Susanna's pale eyes narrowed into slits. "The kind that kept children fed, clothed, and educated instead of letting them die on the streets. Sometimes the perfect family placement isn't available, Mr. Sinclair. Sometimes, for the greater good, you have to make compromises." "Compromises like separating brothers and sisters?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed composure cracked, just for a second, revealing a glimpse of the darkness that lay beneath. How do you know about that?" "I found things," Hiram said, stepping closer, pressing his advantage. "Down in the basement, boxes filled with children's belongings, notes about payments received." He lowered his voice. "What really happened to those children, Miss Radcliffe?" She was quiet for a long, tense moment, her fingers drumming a silent, agitated rhythm against the oak desk. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, dangerous whisper. "You should be very careful, Mr. Sinclair. You're asking questions you might not want the answers to. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." Just then, from outside, a horse whinnied, a nervous, agitated sound, as if it sensed the suffocating tension in the room. But when Hiram glanced out the window, the dusty courtyard was empty. There was no horse. The sound came again, closer this time. The distinct sound of hooves on packed dirt, right outside the building. Hiram moved to the window and peered out. A woman was dismounting from a chestnut mare. She moved with a raw, focused purpose, tying her horse to the old, rusted hitching post as if she had done it 1,000 times before. "Expecting someone?" Hiram asked, turning back to Susanna. Susanna's face had gone bone white, a look of pure, unadulterated shock. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling. She wouldn't dare come back here." The front door of the orphanage suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and the sound of rapid, angry footsteps echoed through the hallway. A moment later, a woman in her 30s stormed into the office. Her brown hair was escaping from a simple braid, and her dress was covered in the dust of a long, hard ride. She stopped in the doorway, her dark eyes locking onto the director. "Hello, Susanna." The newcomer's voice was low and steady, but it carried the weight of years of controlled, simmering anger. "I see you're still playing your games, Margaret." Susanna's voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the thick silence. "You shouldn't be here." The woman, Margaret, ignored her completely. She turned to Hiram and extended a hand, her grip firm and strong. "Margaret Emerson. And you must be the man who bought this cursed place." Hiram studied her face. It was a face etched with a history he was only just beginning to uncover. He saw sharp intelligence in her dark, watchful eyes, and the way she held herself, alert, poised, ready for a fight. "You know each other," he stated, the answer obvious. "Oh, we know each other very well." Margaret's gaze never left Susanna's. It was a look of pure loathing. "She sold me when I was 7 years old." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "She told my new owners that my parents had died in a wagon accident, that I was lucky to have such a fine, wealthy family take me in." Susanna straightened up, trying to regain some of her lost authority, pulling the tatters of her composure around her like a shawl. "You were given opportunities, Margaret. A fine education, a comfortable home you never would have known otherwise." "My parents weren't dead." Margaret's voice cut through the air like a razor. "They spent 15 years searching for me. 15 years believing their only daughter had been taken by wild animals or wandered off into the wilderness. They died without ever knowing what happened to me. They died with their hearts broken." Hiram felt the solid weight of the metal box against his ribs. It felt heavier now. "How did you find out the truth?" he asked gently. "Caleb told me," Margaret said, her eyes briefly glancing around the office, lingering on the familiar objects of her stolen childhood. "Caleb Boone. He worked here as a groundskeeper. A good man, a kind man, until his conscience finally got the better of him. He kept records, Mr. Sinclair. Secret records of every single child who passed through this wicked place. Their real names, where they came from, and where they were sent." Susanna took an involuntary step backward, her face a mask of disbelief. "Caleb is dead. He's been dead for 3 years." "But his records aren't." Margaret smiled, a grim, joyless twist of her lips. "He hid them well, didn't he? It took me months to find them after he passed. He left me a letter. He told me to look where only the children could reach." Hiram's hand moved instinctively to his coat, to the box hidden inside. He and Caleb had been thinking the same thing. "You've been here before," he said. "Recently." "Several times," she confirmed. "I've been documenting everything, gathering evidence, building a case piece by painful piece." Margaret strode to the desk and opened the official ledger, flipping through the pages with a practiced ease that spoke of hours of study. "You see these numbers here?" she asked, pointing to a long column of codes. "They don't correspond to families. They correspond to locations. Not homes, Mr. Sinclair. Work camps, mining operations, brutal places where small hands could fit into tight spaces where grown adults couldn't reach." "That's enough!" Susanna's voice sharpened, regaining some of its old commanding sting. "You have no proof of these wild, hysterical accusations?" Margaret turned slowly to face her former captor, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Don't I?" She reached into the worn leather saddlebag she'd slung over her shoulder and pulled out a thick, bulging folder. She slammed it down on the desk. It was filled with papers, old photographs, and copies of letters. 47 children, Susanna, she said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. That's how many went missing under your care in the last 10 years alone. I've found 23 of them so far. Found them alive. The room fell silent, the only sound the loud, rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall, each tick like a hammer blow. And what I discovered about the other 24, it will destroy you. Margaret began spreading the papers across the desk with a deliberate, chilling precision. Hiram stared at the photographs of the children. Some were smiling, their faces full of an innocence that was about to be shattered. Others stared back at the camera with haunted, hollow eyes that seemed far too old for their young faces. These 24 children were different, Margaret continued, her finger tracing the outline of a young boy's face in one of the photos. They were older when they arrived here. Old enough to remember their families, their real names. Old enough to cause problems, to ask questions, to try and escape. Susanna's breathing had become rapid and shallow. "You don't understand," she gasped. "You don't understand the pressures we were under. The territorial government provided no funding, no support. We had to find alternative solutions to stay open." "Alternative solutions?" Margaret laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the silent room. "Is that what you call it when children vanish off the face of the earth? When there's no record of where they went, who took them, or if they're even still alive?" Feeling the moment was right, Hiram pulled the cold metal box from his coat and placed it on the desk. Both women turned to stare at it. "Caleb left this behind the wall panel," he said. "I think it might have the answers about those 24. Margaret's eyes widened with a flash of recognition. "That's his emergency box. He told me about it in his letter, but he never said where he hid it." In a flash, Susanna lunged forward, her hand outstretched like a claw, trying to snatch the box. But Margaret was faster. She grabbed Susanna's wrist, her grip like iron. "No more secrets, Susanna. It all ends today." With trembling fingers, Hiram worked the rusted latch on the box. It sprang open with a groan. Inside, carefully wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth, were dozens of small, tintype photographs and a thick leather journal. The journal fell open as he lifted it, landing on a page marked with a faded red ribbon. At the top of the page, in Caleb's careful, elegant handwriting, were 2 words. "The disappeared." And below them, a heartbreaking sign-off. "May God forgive us all." Below that was a list. Names, ages, and dates. And next to each entry was a location. A location that made Hiram's blood turn to ice in his veins. Copper Canyon Mine, Shaft 7. Silver Creek Excavation, deep tunnels. Mountain Ridge Operation, dynamite work. "They sent children into the mines," Hiram whispered, the words catching in his throat. "The dangerous jobs. The ones adults wouldn't risk." Margaret nodded, her face a grim mask of sorrow and fury. Small bodies could crawl through collapsed tunnels. Little hands could place explosive charges in spaces too narrow for grown men. And if something went wrong... She gestured to the pile of photographs. No one would ever know they existed. They were ghosts. Susanna finally found her voice, a weak, reedy sound. "It was necessary. Those mining operations provided jobs for hundreds of families in this territory. It was a few sacrifices. For the greater good." "Sacrifices?" Margaret's voice rose to a furious shout. "They were children. They had names. They had families who loved them. They had dreams." Hiram, still reeling, turned to the last page of Caleb's journal. What he found there made his hands begin to shake uncontrollably. It was a map, hand-drawn in black ink. It showed the hills and canyons of the surrounding territory, and scattered all across it were small, hand-drawn X's. At each X, there was a number that corresponded to one of the lost children in the journal. Caleb found them, Margaret said, her voice now quiet and choked with emotion. He spent his final years documenting where they were buried, in unmarked graves. He told me the least he could do was make sure they weren't forgotten completely. Susanna was backing away now, her eyes wide with panic, her composure completely shattered. She stumbled toward the door. You can't prove any of this. Those records, they could have been forged. Caleb was unstable in his final years. Everyone knew that. He was senile. Margaret smiled, a cold, predatory smile. She reached back into her folder and pulled out one final folded document. That's where you're wrong, Susanna. She unfolded the paper and held it up. This is a signed confession. From the mine foreman at Copper Canyon. He kept his own detailed records. Records of every child worker who died in those tunnels. Records with names that match Caleb's journal perfectly. She let the paper fall onto the desk. The confession is dated just 2 weeks ago. He's still alive, Susanna, and he's willing to testify about everything he knows. If you're finding this story as shocking as Hiram is, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from the Old West that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Susanna's face twisted into a mask of pure rage and desperation. She lunged, not for the box, but for the confession in Margaret's hands. But Margaret was ready. She snatched the papers back, clutching them to her chest. You have no idea what you're destroying, Susanna hissed, her voice venomous. This orphanage saved more children than it lost. The mining work gave those troublemakers purpose, discipline. They would have died on the streets anyway. Purpose? Margaret's voice cracked with a raw, heartbreaking emotion. Tommy Brennan was 8 years old when you sent him to Copper Canyon. 8. He died setting dynamite charges because his hands were small enough to reach the tight spaces you and your business partners needed. Hiram turned his attention back to the small photographs from Caleb's hidden box. He studied them more closely, looking past the initial horror. Each child's face told a story of innocence betrayed. But as he flipped through the small, haunting portraits, he noticed something else. Something that made his stomach clench into a tight, cold knot. These aren't all orphans, he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Both women stopped, their argument frozen in midair. They turned to look at him. Some of these children, they're too well-dressed, too healthy-looking when they arrived. They had families who cared for them. He held up a photograph of a little girl in a pristine lace dress, her hair in 2 carefully plaited braids. This child wasn't abandoned on your doorstep. She was taken. Margaret snatched the photograph from his hand. Her face went pale as she stared at it, her eyes widening in recognition of something in the background. That's outside the general store on Main Street. I remember that day. There were stories. Whispers around town about children disappearing. Parents would claim their children had been kidnapped right off the street. But the sheriff always said they must have just wandered off. Susanna laughed again, that same bitter, mirthless sound. Sheriff Caldwell knew exactly what was happening. He was paid very well to look the other way, just like Judge Morrison was, just like half the territorial officials were. Did you really think an operation this profitable could run for 20 years without protection from very important men? The revelation hit Hiram like a physical blow. The corruption wasn't just here, in this building. It was the entire foundation of the town. The law itself was rotten to the core. How many people were involved? He asked, horrified. Enough, Susanna said, her eyes darting toward the window, calculating her escape routes. Enough to make sure no one asked uncomfortable questions. The mining companies needed small, cheap workers for the most dangerous jobs. Wealthy families out in California wanted children to work their estates without having to pay real wages. Everyone got what they wanted. Margaret grabbed Susanna by the arm, spinning her around with surprising strength. Except the children! They got death sentences! Some died! Yes! Susanna shrieked, jerking her arm free from Margaret's grip. But many lived comfortable lives with their new families. Better lives than their real parents, who were too poor or too drunk to care for them, ever could have provided. A lie, and they all knew it. Hiram, sickened, opened Caleb's journal again, flipping through the pages, looking for anything more. And then he saw it. A page he hadn't noticed before. Written in bright red ink, as if marked for special, urgent importance, was a list of names under a chilling heading. Current operations, still active. His blood turned to ice as he read the first entry. New facility established 50 miles north. Current inventory, 23 children. Next shipment scheduled for month's end. This is still happening, he whispered, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. Margaret grabbed the journal from his hands, her eyes scanning the page with frantic speed. Where? Where is this other facility? Susanna's expression shifted, her desperation melting away, replaced by a cold, cruel satisfaction. You're too late to stop it, she sneered. The final shipment leaves tomorrow morning. 23 more children will disappear forever, just like all the others. She reached into a hidden pocket in her dress and pulled out a small, ornate brass key. She dangled it in front of them. But I might be persuaded to tell you the location. For the right price. Suddenly, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the empty courtyard. Not one horse, but several. Ah, Susanna smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile this time. My associates have arrived. 3 men on horseback rode into the courtyard, their faces hard and weathered by the sun and a life of casual cruelty. The leader, a tall man with a silver badge pinned to his vest, dismounted with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to wielding absolute authority. Sheriff Caldwell, Margaret breathed, her voice filled with dawning horror. I should have known. The sheriff, flanked by his 2 deputies, approached the orphanage entrance. Through the grimy window, Hiram could see the cold calculation in the man's eyes. This wasn't a rescue mission. Susanna called for help, I see, Hiram said grimly, the trap closing around them. Oh, she did more than that, Margaret replied, her eyes still glued to the journal pages, a new wave of alarm washing over her face. Look at this entry, from last week. Sheriff Caldwell confirmed transport route clear. No interference expected from territorial authorities. Susanna's smile widened as the sound of heavy boots echoed on the front porch. I told you this operation had protection. The sheriff has been ensuring our operations run smoothly for 15 years. The front door swung open, and Sheriff Caldwell's voice boomed through the hallway. Susanna! You said there was trouble in here! Sheriff! She called out, her voice sickly sweet. We have some visitors. They've been asking some very inappropriate questions about our former residents. Caldwell appeared in the office doorway, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered pistol. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. The scattered papers, the open journal, the incriminating photographs spread across the desk. I see, he said, his voice deceptively mild. Folks who don't understand the complexities of territorial child welfare. Margaret stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. We understand perfectly, Sheriff. We understand that you've been helping her cover up the kidnapping and murder of children for profit. Those are strong accusations, miss, Caldwell said, his tone still calm, but his eyes were as cold and hard as winter steel. I hope you have more than just some old papers and wild theories to back them up. Hiram clutched the metal box tighter. It was a powder keg of evidence. Names, dates, locations, confessions, enough to hang every single person in this room. But with the sheriff and his 2 deputies controlling the exits, that evidence might never see the light of day. The territorial governor will be very interested to see what we've found here, Hiram said, praying his voice sounded more confident than he felt. Caldwell laughed. A deep, ugly sound. Governor Harrison? He's the one who suggested we expand the operations northward. Those children you're so concerned about are being put to productive use. Better than letting them starve on the streets. Margaret's face had gone chalk white. You're all monsters. We're practical men, Miss Emerson, Caldwell replied smoothly. Making practical decisions in an impractical world. Susanna moved to stand beside the sheriff, a united front of pure evil. And now, she said, her voice dripping with menace, we need to make another practical decision. About what to do with witnesses who know far too much. One of the deputies stepped into the room, his large frame blocking the only other exit. The second deputy remained by the front door, ensuring there was no escape through the main hallway. Hiram's mind raced, searching for an out, a move, anything. The evidence was damning, but it was worthless if they didn't survive to present it. He thought about the map in Caleb's journal. The locations of the unmarked graves, scattered like scars across the territory. Before you do anything irreversible, Sheriff, Hiram said, his voice careful and measured, you should know that copies of all these documents have already been sent to the territorial capital. It was a complete and total lie, but it was the only card he had left to play. Caldwell's expression darkened. Is that so? Margaret, brilliant and quick, caught on immediately. 3 copies, actually, she added, her voice ringing with false confidence. 1 to the governor's office, 1 to the head territorial marshal, and a 3rd to a very curious newspaper editor in Denver who loves stories about corruption in the territories. The room fell dead silent. The only sounds were the incessant ticking of the clock and the nervous shifting of the horses outside. Susanna's confident smile began to waver. The silence stretched out, pulled as taut as a rope about to snap. Sheriff Caldwell's eyes darted between Hiram and Margaret, his mind clearly racing, trying to calculate the odds, weighing the risk of their claim being true. You're lying, he said finally, but a flicker of uncertainty had crept into his voice. Margaret stepped closer to the desk, her hand resting protectively on Caleb's journal. Am I? Ask yourself this, Sheriff. How do you think I found this place? How do you think I knew exactly when to arrive today? Hiram picked up the thread instantly. We've been planning this for months, Sheriff. Margaret made contact with the territorial marshals weeks ago. They're already investigating scattered reports of missing children in 3 different counties. It wasn't entirely a lie. Margaret had been documenting the cases for years, and there had been scattered reports. They were stretching the truth as thin as a spider's web, but it was just enough. Susanna's composure finally shattered completely. They're lying! You can't prove anything! Those children were better off! Better off dead? Margaret's voice cut through the room like a whip. I found the grave sites, Susanna. Caleb mapped every single one. She snatched the journal, flipped it open to the hand-drawn map, and thrust it toward Caldwell. 37 unmarked graves scattered across your mining territories. 37 children who died in cave-ins, explosions, and accidents that never would have happened if you hadn't sent babies to do a man's dangerous work. The sheriff stared at the map, his face growing paler as he recognized the locations marked with Caleb's grim X's. This proves nothing, he blustered. Mining is dangerous work. Accidents happen. Not to 8-year-old children, you monster! Margaret's fury was a living thing in the room, a storm about to break. Not when those children should have been playing with toys, not placing sticks of dynamite. Hiram watched the deputies. He saw one of them, a younger man, shifting uncomfortably by the door. The young man's face was a canvas of dawning horror as he listened to the volley of accusations. Not everyone in this room was a lost cause. Deputy Morrison, Hiram said, addressing the younger man directly, his voice calm and firm. Did you know what you were protecting? Did you know it was about the children? The deputy's hand, which had been resting on his gun, moved away. I thought. We were just keeping the peace in the territory, he stammered. Nobody told me about. Shut your mouth, Morrison, Caldwell snapped, but his authority was cracking, the foundations crumbling beneath him. Margaret seized the moment, pressing her attack. How many more children have to die for your profit, Sheriff? Right now, as we speak, there are 23 children locked away in a new facility, waiting to be shipped to the camps. Children who will be dead within a year if we don't stop this. The second deputy, the one by the main entrance, spoke up, his voice troubled. Sheriff, if what they're saying is true... It's not true! Susanna shrieked, her voice thin and hysterical. They're making it all up. Caleb was senile in his final years. These records are worthless. But Hiram had found something else in the metal box. Something he hadn't shown them yet. Something that would obliterate their lives forever. A photograph. A photograph of a mining camp, with the tiny, unmistakable figures of children working near dangerous-looking machinery. On the back, in Caleb's neat, damning script, were 5 words. Copper Canyon, 1874. Last photo before the explosion. Only 2 survived. He held up the photograph for them all to see. Caleb documented everything, didn't he? Every crime, every death, every single cover-up. The room fell dead silent as everyone stared at the damning, undeniable image. And then, from outside, came a new sound. The thundering sound of many horses approaching, and approaching fast. The approaching riders weren't more corrupt officials coming to cover up a crime. This time, they were the law. They were a troop of territorial marshals, led by a stern-faced man with official federal credentials pinned to his coat. Margaret's bluff about contacting the authorities, it turned out, hadn't been entirely false after all. Marshal Davidson, Margaret called out as the lead rider dismounted, relief flooding her voice. Perfect timing. Sheriff Caldwell's face went completely ashen. He looked at Margaret, his expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. Margaret, what have you done? What I should have done years ago, she replied, her voice steady and strong. She walked past the stunned deputies and handed Marshal Davidson Caleb's journal and the damning photograph. I sent a preliminary report of my findings to the main territorial office 3 weeks ago. Marshal Davidson has been quietly investigating the missing children reports from multiple counties ever since. The marshal studied the evidence quickly, his grim expression growing harder and colder with each page he turned. He looked up, his eyes locking on the corrupt sheriff. Sheriff Caldwell, you and your deputies are under arrest for conspiracy, child endangerment, and multiple counts of murder. You can't prove murder! Susanna protested desperately, her voice cracking. Those were accidents, tragic accidents. Ma'am, we found the northern facility yesterday, the marshal said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. We found 23 children held in conditions that would shame a prison warden. The mine foreman you mentioned, Miss Emerson, he nodded to Margaret, has already provided a full, signed confession in exchange for clemency. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief flooded through Hiram, so powerful it almost made his knees buckle. The children, they were safe. All 23 are now in protective federal custody, the marshal continued. We're already working to reunite them with their real families. He then turned his cold, hard gaze on Susanna. Miss Radcliffe, you are also under arrest for human trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder. As the marshals placed heavy iron shackles on Caldwell and Susanna's wrists, the disgraced sheriff made one last, desperate plea. You don't understand the economics of this territory. Those mining operations employ hundreds of people. The children, they served a purpose. The only purpose a child should serve, Margaret said, her voice filled with a cold, righteous fury, is to grow up safe and loved. Deputy Morrison, the young one, stepped forward and took off his badge, holding it out to the marshal. Marshal, I want to cooperate. Fully. I didn't know about the children, sir, but I should have asked more questions. I should have known something was wrong. Marshal Davidson looked at the young man and gave a single approving nod. Your cooperation will be noted, son. As the prisoners were loaded onto their horses for the long ride to the territorial capital and the justice they so richly deserved, Hiram stood in the empty orphanage one final time. The building would never be a hotel. It would never house children in fear again. But it had served one last vital purpose. It had revealed the truth. Margaret came and stood beside him in the silent, dusty office. Caleb would be proud, she said softly. His records, his courage. It saved those 23 children, and it will prevent this from ever happening again. What will you do now? Hiram asked her. Continue the work, she said without hesitation. There are other territories, other corrupt officials, other children who need someone to speak for them. She managed a small, grim smile. And you? You still planning to build your fancy hotel here? Hiram looked around the room where so much pain and suffering had been planned and carried out. No, he said, a new idea, a better idea forming in his mind. I think this place should become something different. Maybe a school, a real one, where children can learn and play safely, without fear. Margaret's smile widened, and this time, it was genuine. Caleb would like that, she said. He would like that very much. As they walked out of the dark, haunted building and into the bright sunlight together, Hiram realized that sometimes the most important purchases aren't for buildings or for land. Sometimes they're for the chance to right terrible wrongs and give a voice back to those who can no longer speak for themselves. The abandoned orphanage would soon be filled with the sounds of children again, but this time it would be the sound of laughter instead of tears. If you enjoyed this incredible story of justice and courage, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and determination collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more amazing stories like this one. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue uncovering these remarkable tales from the Old West.